please send them via Zoom or Twitter. And thanks very much to everybody. Can you hear me well? Yes, it is really a pleasure for me to be here with you, and where we thank the hospitality of the World Bank and their trust for cooperating with us in UDP and this project. This project was launched back by the World Bank in 2020 with 13 countries across the region. The importance of this project was to measure how what was the COVID crisis impact across the region, and we decided to work together, and so we added 11 additional countries, including five Caribbean countries. We feel this is a very important project, and as a regional director for Latin American, the Caribbean, it is an example of the type of cooperation we can have with the World Bank. Thanks very much to Luis Felipe Jaramillo and Jimena del Carpio, who was our technical counterpart, and Gabriela Melendez, our senior economist at the UNDP for Latin American and the Caribbean, together with all the teams that have worked with us so diligently in this endeavor. I think it is very important to have evidence and the importance of designing policies and interventions that are based on evidence, and that's precisely what we are aiming at in this case. There are indeed many other things that we could do together, but we will talk about that later. Thanks very much, then, for joining this conversation. I'm going to cover some of the important findings, and that also pose major challenges for economic policy and social policy makers. And later, also, both Jimena and Marcela will go into a more detailed presentation of the findings. We have talked about the disproportionate or the disproportionate impact of the pandemic in our region. This is something that has already been widely debated, but I think that it's important to add rigorous comparable evidence based on more figures and findings. For instance, among the findings, the average rate of occupation is late jobs. The job rate is still behind pre-pandemic efforts. The number of hours of work per week is 14% lower than before the pandemic. It is also important to talk about food insecurity that increased significantly during the pandemic. And it's also very important from my viewpoint to address educational issues. Much has been discussed about the cross-generational impact in education, and that, of course, has to do with the educational system. 12 education activity is at 12% below the pre-pandemic attendance rates. All these figures that we will be examining in more detail in a moment pose a number of public policy making challenges of great importance at the UNDP. We have also echoed, as has been said elsewhere, this is a situation in which a structure met conjuncture, all the pre-existing vulnerabilities that were already present in the Latin American and Caribbean regions deepened and have interacted with the pandemic shock that have led us to the outcomes that we will be examining in more detail in a minute. I think it is also important to see what the disproportionate impact has been on women. The survey shows clearly as that the likelihood of employability for women dropped to less than half of men's as a result of the pandemic. I think there are many, many important issues and data that have to nurture our pandemic and post-pandemic review. But and Luis Felipe will be talking about that in a minute. But before that, Jimena and Marcela will be sharing with us a more detailed presentation. Thanks very much. This is a very important conversation for the region. Before we turn it over to Jimena, I want to thank the people that are following us online. They can use the hashtag World Bank Alac and also follow us on UNDP's Facebook site. Thanks very much. for the presentation. Good morning and good afternoon to everybody. I just wanted to take the opportunity to underscore that this cooperation effort allows us to measure the pulse of the region, and that's very important to know in which direction we should be heading, where our efforts should be aiming at efforts to stop further deterioration as we have seen so far. And there are many important things, but I will start by mentioning the effort that has been launched this and it has involved two very large teams from both the World Bank and UNDP and that are now engaging in a more rigorous analysis, but initially has made a huge effort in data gathering. I would like to underscore this effort started in 2020 with three countries by the World Bank and together with UNDP. We have carried out this survey in 24 places. They include all the way from food security to digital access and everything that we need to better understand what is the condition of households in the surveyed areas. And we also have gathered data on the vaccination that we have added to this analysis. The methodology is very strict and rigorous. I should just mention that we have sought to determine using a telephone survey whether landlines or mobiles to survey 18-year-olds and older. This is a random digital survey. This is a very well-known methodology. These are telephone surveys, and in addition to ourselves, we have worked together with the partners that have financed certain surveys in various regions across LAC. I would like to share with you some important landmarks of the descriptive analysis. We are now just giving you an overview of the descriptive phases. I will be talking about the labor market, incomes, uh, malnutrition, and gender. And Marcela will continue with the other modules. I would like to mention that there is a huge wealth of data and information that we are going to be sharing today. This is only an initial presentation. What have we found? That there have been there's been a huge unemployment as a consequence, and about one in every four persons across the region have not yet been able to get their jobs back before the pandemic. Before the pre-pandemic levels, Colombia, Panama, and Honduras, and Haiti will always be at the end. But it mentioned the countries that have made a significant effort and have not yet have been able to recover pre-pandemic and employment levels. Who has been most adversely affected by the pandemic? It's been basically women more than men, and even worse, uh, mothers of very small children from 0 to 5 years old. Also, people in vulnerable ages, uh, and young people have lost their jobs more likely, and also people with less level of schooling or less labor skills. This transparency shows the average uh, job rates that are still below pre-pandemic levels. The data shows the condition of people before the pandemic and in June 2021. So we can see whether there's been some recovery in high schools. Region-wide, there is still a long way to recover. The three countries on the right-hand side, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and El Salvador, have recovered, are gone back, or even have increased their jobs. So you might think that this is a good fact, and it certainly is. But unfortunately, the quality of that uh, employment has degraded across the region. In all countries, the quality of work that has remained or has been created during the pandemic has deteriorated significantly. The transparency shows that formal employment has diminished almost 5% region-wide, and but there is a huge range of diversity. On the right hand side, we see that people that had to resort to um, self-employment has also increased. This slide shows that in addition to employment, jobs, uh, self-employment and informal jobs, we see also the less hours that are employed by companies or employers, and that may be because the people cannot work on a full-time basis or because their jobs are not those are jobs that are being offered on the supply side cannot be performed on a full-time basis. That remains to be examined, but still there is a 14 percent point drop. On the right hand side, we can see that the number of formal employment has also dropped. Men typically have moved towards informality to a greater extent. Many have re-entered the labor market, but on an informal basis, back from their informal employment, and also for the higher age brackets. And also, we see that there's been an increase in self-employment and informal employment. The next transparency shows that many of the people that lost their jobs have completely exited the labor market, left the labor market. 60% of the people that lost their jobs have left the labor market. As well as many of you know, we have made many accomplishments in increasing the number of women that join economic activity, particularly women. But during the pandemic, we have seen a setback, and therefore we have to think how public policies can help us recover the gains that we had experienced previously, so that the people will not remain as economically inactive. We also want to we wanted to know where the new uh, jobless came from. Many of them came from micro companies, very small companies. But as particularly curious is that, as is shown in the next slide, that there's been a change in the labor force that has moved from large, intermediate, and small companies that have moved to micro companies or have become a self-employed. And as we know, these are lower productivity companies, typically, not always, but generally, they are less productive companies. And that is also where we have to focus our efforts from the viewpoint of a public policy, so that all these people will not remain as workers in micro companies or involved in a more vulnerable economic roles if there is a future different or additional shock. I would also like to talk about incomes. And despite the fact that there are many people that have gone back to the labor market, there are still 50% of households that have not yet been able to recover their total incomes and revenues. And this takes into account the fact that many of these households have received transfer money. And the next transparency shows that 46% of households have received some sort of a transfer, whether a regular transfer that they already received because of their poverty condition, prior poverty conditions, or our emergency transfers. And the combination of both has been received by 46% of countries like Bolivia, Salvador, and Guyana, where emergency transfers have been very high. In Mexico or Nicaragua, they continue to receive the regular transfers. There's not been a change due to emergency transfers, but throughout the region, 50% of the people have not been able to recover their regular incomes, whether from their participation in the labor market or transfers, including uh, remittances or private transfers. This has a direct implication on food security. Undoubtedly, households and families, as is shown here, in all countries, there has been a drop in access to food, either from the quality or the quantity sides, but the number of households that were left without food in the first 30 days has been higher than before the pandemic, or even before 2020 during at the beginning of the pandemic in 2020. This transparency shows that, as Luis Felipe mentioned, the countries that are already doing poorly, like for instance, if you look at the poverty or inequality viewpoint, the countries that were already more unequal or that show higher poverty levels were the ones that suffered most from the viewpoint of food insecurity. Undoubtedly, the countries that we're going to be examining in regards of inequality, like Colombia, where Colombia is very, very high, has also suffered a lot in uh, food security. And likewise, on the as we see on the right-hand side of the slide, when it comes to poverty, this means that we really have to think as organizations and what we can do to prevent this slide in access to food, because obviously that has a great impact on human capital, future human capital building. And um, there's been a lot of a significant drop in women's participation in the labor market across the region. There's been some progress for several years, and there, however, twice as many probabilities for women to have lost their jobs. The loss was very significant for both, but it is worse among women, and even worse with mothers of children, 5 year olds and younger. The gap has increased, the gap between men and women has widened across the region. And one of the main reasons generally is household chores and care tasks that has increased for both men and women, but more significantly so among women. In particular, this has to do with school attendance. Many of the mothers of very young children had to increase the number of hours that they, okay, school assistants by mothers to their children. And Marcela is going to expand a little bit on that when it comes to talking about education. The degradation in the labor market also uh, in, includes issues that are perhaps not that easily measurable. Uh, the loss of jobs also has to do a lot with mental health and the increase in home chores, household chores. So that's another thing that we have to pay much attention to. And I'm going to turn it over to Marcela. I'm going to give her the laptop so that she will be talking to us about health, financial institutions.
Please let me show you the first results of this joint work. As we were saying before, this is materials that these are the materials that we're giving to the region so that we can think forward. What has happened in the education sector? And of girls and boys that are participating in some kind of educational activity. This varies between countries, and it is a step back regarding what we had before the pandemic. At the moment, we have not attained the pre-pandemic levels. Before the pandemic, percentage of attendance was 12 points higher, especially in the countries in the Caribbean, like Guyana, Caribbean, Belize, and in Honduras and Guatemala. The breach regarding the pre-pandemic situation is very high. However, worst part of it is that only 23% of children that are currently attending some kind of school activity are doing it uh, in presence. And this is one of the big challenges of the pandemic. There are some countries in which the closure of schools has been lower, but in most countries, this is an extremely low figure. And if it's a tragedy, if we also take into account that virtual learning is also pretty bad. The lack of access to the internet or to devices is one of the reasons for not participating in remote learning. When we ask why children attend or not attend school, the lack of internet and internet connection is probably the most frequent reason. There is also the fact that the children don't want to participate. Children and adolescents don't want to participate in these activities, and also the fact that schools lack devices or technology to access virtual education, the virtual education that is being delivered. We know that this is very different for um, boys and girls that are in the higher economic classes. So this is a crisis that has hit homes very differently. Uh, Richer children have more opportunities to participate uh, in activities, although their attendance is also virtual. And so here we can see the difference between richer homes and poorer homes. What we can see is that the proportion of children that have attended school is higher when the assets in the home are higher too. So it's 77% for the homes that have between assets, and it's higher for the homes that have more assets. So children and adolescents have lived very unequally pandemic, and this is something that is going to cost. This is something that is going to cost us later. Health sector, there's a good news here because one year after the pandemic, the health services have been reestablished in most countries. 5% of homes have had some trouble to access health services. Uh, this happens especially in Ecuador, Haiti, and Colombia, where 10% approximately and 7.4 percent of people have tried to have access to health service and have not been able to. So this is pretty different from what we had in 2019 in the survey of 2019, survey by the World Bank. This is a small bullet that appears above each country. So here the region has been able to contain part of the disaster. Here, people and homes are going back to preventive health care. This is something that went very wrong during the pandemic. And now 47% of the homes is demanding preventive health services. This is not the same between the different countries. In Brazil, the percentage is very low, and this takes the regional percentage down. But well, this is one of the good pieces of news. Latin America and the Caribbean has been progressing in terms of vaccination, but it's unequal between the different countries. This is the self-report that we have obtained through the survey. As we can see, it's very high in countries such as Chile, Brazil, Uruguay, and it's almost inexistent in Haiti. But what we have to look at here is that 8%, that dark 8%, this is the Latin American average, and this is 17% of the people in the region that are not vaccinated and that that are, that have doubts regarding if they want to get a vaccine or not. Here we have a disaggregated vision. Approximately one-fifth of the non-vaccinated people do not want to get vaccinated. This is especially the case in rural homes, in among the elderly, and among people that have a lower educational level. You can see how the percentage drops if you for people that have more education. Uh, Look at the three light blue bars in the end. People that don't want to get vaccinated do not believe that it is efficient, and they are also very doubtful regarding vaccines. So this is a big challenge for public policy. Let's look at digital and finances now. This is We have a good story here. This is something that the pandemic forced us to do, and indeed, there are bankerization modes, digital bankerization modes, and technology actually made a leap. 49, 50% of homes reported they started using more digital transactions during the pandemic. This includes mobile banking and also apps, web pages for transactions. So this is a very big leap, and it is true for both uh, access modalities for financial services. Mobile wallets um, are great for the part of the population that are usually a little bit further from banking. This is true for rural populations. And here you can see the people that were surveyed from each group, and they use mobile wallets. And you can also see the new users. So the light bars represent the new users. And although digital wallets are lower in the rural sector, 35% of the users are new users, and this is also true for less educated people. And so this is a sign of progress, although the penetration of these kinds of tools is still low. But still, we can see a big leap during the pandemic. This graph shows internet connectivity. We can see 2019 and 2021. And so all the countries that we have measured are above the line, the 45% line. And here we are closing some gaps regarding connection. This doesn't mean that the breach does not exist. Rural homes are still disadvantaged, and internet coverage is not perfect, but we have made a leap during the pandemic. And some of the difficult elements here regarding public policy is that when we ask people that are connected to the internet what are the problems that they have had, then there's a there's a high percentage that reports that the service is too costly for 30% of the homes, and 37% of the homes have had problems with the connection due to intermittence in the electrical supply. There are some countries like Paraguay, Honduras, Guyana, Panama that have very high percentages in terms of interruption due to electrical problems, and also due to service permanence. And the very sad case is Haiti, that has um, a very low number of homes connected to the internet, and they have problems with the internet as well as electrical problems. Thank you very much to the World Bank teams, and thank you very much to everyone working through the weekend so that we can have this data set complete. Thank you very much, Marcela Jimena. And now I want to welcome Carlos Felipe Jaramillo, that is now with us. And we have some questions. Thank you very much to everyone that is following us on Facebook, Twitter, and Zoom. And now let's start with questions for Jimena. What is the percentage of poverty percentage in the region? Thank you, Anna. In 2021, it's around 25%. This has been, uh, this is 2 percentage points regarding what we had before the pandemic. So we hope that there will be some recovery. This is without including Brazil. And with Brazil, it's around 24%. And Jimena, we have some questions regarding employment. First thing, why in Nicaragua and Salvador do we have higher employment levels regarding the uh, rates before the pandemic? And the pandemic created unemployment as well as more informality. Is this a trend that will keep up after the pandemic, especially if we consider that the composition of employment is changing? How can we prepare for this new scenario, for this new employment scenario? This is a great question. I'm going to try to combine both because I think that they have a similar answer. This answer is the survey is a great lantern that sheds light on different areas that we need to look at. We need to make our analysis finer and we need to improve our public policy approaches. So, what we are seeing descriptively is what Luis Felipe said, meaning the that the juncture uh, the countries that had high levels of informality, high levels of inequality and poverty, and in many cases with limitations regarding the fiscal aspect, are countries that have been unable to contain the damages caused by the pandemic. So there is an exacerbation of all problems in these countries: malnutrition, poverty, unemployment, etc. When we see some recovery in the employment rate in the countries that you mentioned, Dana, we can see that this also goes with a weakening of the quality of work. So sometimes people have gone back to their jobs, but now they are informal, they are self-employed, and they are trying to make ends meet to get through the moment. So yes, they are in the job market, or maybe they are self-employed, but they are not necessarily working in the jobs that they were working at before the pandemic. Okay, Marcella, I have a couple of questions for you. First question regarding something that we have been looking at in the region. This is a digital aspect and the lack of access to the internet. This is one of the main reasons why children are not participating in remote learning. So how can we close this digital gap? I believe that we need deliberate action from the government, and it also has to be. We also need to have alliances with the private sector because there was a huge leap in 2 years. So we need to continue with that kind of progress regarding coverage. When we think about how to help our children to move forward regarding education, the fact that they're behind, how can we get them back to schools very quickly? But when we talk about digitalization and the internet as a tool for education, we have to remember that contents and literacy are very important, not only for children, but also for teachers and parents. So that it's not only about the internet, it's the internet connection, it's um, comprehensive efforts so that the internet has can be a complementary tool. And another question for you. So, what's the key for recovery with equity? I want to go back to the education topic. I think that this is the most problematic part. As vaccination progresses, job markets are doing better. And while they have some structural problems and they have challenges, but what did happen, and it was very painful, is that we had to leave. Um, we know that there are kids that have been studying through WhatsApp. I'm still trying to figure out what it means. We have a very big, we have a very big lag, and societies are going to become more unequal unless we do something about it. So I think that if we want equitable, a more equitable situation, we need to solve that lag, and we need to look at the children that are in the poorest homes in the region. Thank you very much, Marcela. It is a big subject, and there are a lot of questions and that require very big answers. And well, I'm sorry because I think that at the beginning of the event, I gave you another name, so I'm very sorry. And let me ask a couple of questions. Why is this data set so important after the pandemic? Do we have some recommendation for a political class? I think that we have spoken about a new social contract, but we haven't said explicitly what it means. And I think that this has to do with that conversation. As economists and as development specialists, we tend to think about the tools, but we need to also agree about the goals, common goals. The idea is to have a region and societies that are more collective, more inclusive, more sustainable. And in that sense, climate action is a huge opportunity. Uh, Digitization, how we think about social protection. So we are talking about tools, but we need evidence. We need to understand reality. We need to read the reality correctly. And I think that this kind of work uh, is very important so that the conversation regarding tools and goals is more effective. We need to revert some of the trends, and this requires very decided public action. Okay, thank you very much. Another question. How can the World Bank and UNDP collaborate so that recovery is better uh, in case of other pandemics? Well, I don't know because this is a very complicated question. What I would talk about is some gaps. When we talk about defining objectives and tools, there are gaps that we need to close. There are education gaps, information gaps, operational gaps, legitimacy gaps in terms of governance. And and I think that we can contribute to closing some of those gaps more than some gaps are more closable than others, but we are actively working for that. As UNDP, we don't have resources, but we are a channel so, to take to close in resources and needs like we did in Mexico. So we need to close some financing gaps in spaces where we have an added value to bring. Uh, this is also the case for knowledge gaps, implementation gaps. I think that in both cases, the World Bank and UNDP can do very complementary work. We do last mile work, and we work with our counterparts. We work in the kitchen with the governments, so as to speak, so that we can close implementation gaps. And we also need to bring more legitimacy to those who do public policy so that the policies can be more effective, and there are spaces in which UNDP can work and the World Bank cannot work, like for example, election quality, um, public deliberation. I think that we're very complementary on those topics, and I think that if we do it together, our voice will be larger, amplified. Okay, we have many more questions, so we're going to try to answer most of them. So, how can we finance the region's recovery? How can we face the changes that we need in a more inclusive manner? Thank you, Anna. And I would like to, I'm very happy to be working here with my UNDP colleagues. It's very important to work with them in this very important topic. So, I agree with the idea that it is not ideal to go back to where the region was in 2019. 2019 looks like a better year than 2020 because of the pandemic, but actually it was not a good year. If you recall, it was a year filled with demonstrations, strikes, and in a lot of countries in the region. And the growth was also pretty low. I think it was approximately 0% per capita for the region. So, what I would say is that I have three talking points. Three talking points so that the region uh, becomes stronger after this experience. We need to have a higher economic growth, higher than what we had before the pandemic. It needs to be also more inclusive and more equitable, and it also needs to be greener. All these are pending reforms, and they are well known, they're not new, but they have been pending, and the countries have not developed the consensus that allow to reach this. First of all, we need more education, or we need a consensus regarding education. We know that the region has a problem regarding the quality of education for the vast majorities, and it has become worse with the pandemic. But this topic needs to be solved because we are lagging regarding primary education, secondary education, and partly university education. And we also need to invest to improve employment and private investment. Some of the economies are doing better now, they're growing, but they are growing especially in informal employment and not in formal employment. And I think that this is one of the learned lessons during the pandemic. Informality is a huge problem in the region, and we need to find ways to deal with this. And finally, the green agenda, as Luis Felipe said, is a very interesting agenda for this region. On one hand, there is deforestation in our region. Many of the countries in our region depend on deforestation to continue spreading food production, and this doesn't make much sense if we have technology to consolidate the rural frontier so that we can use the land that we are already using. Then we have renewables, renewable energy. This is still a very small percent. This still has a very small percentage in the region, but we have a lot of wind, sun potential, and also with green hydrogen. And we also have the urban mobility agenda. This has to do with air quality and with gradually replacing public and private vehicle fleet, uh, to have newer, less polluting options. So this is a big agenda, so that we can become stronger after this experience. Okay, I'm looking at a question. I don't know if you want to answer that too. So, what are the growth drivers after the pandemic in the region? Is the investment in infrastructure and connectivity still crucial? I would answer that in two parts. I am convinced that the uh, driver of Latin American economies is the private sector. This is why I was talking about uh, how important reforms are to stimulate uh, private employment. But it is also important to have a complementary public investment, and infrastructure is also pending. The infrastructure agenda is also pending. Investments have been very low regarding some other regions uh, that compete with Latin America, like, for example, the Asian region. I believe that if we leave this when we leave the pandemic, it's very important for countries to review their fiscal policies. Everyone is a little bit more indebted and a little bit weaker. Some were very weak at the beginning of the pandemic, and so others were a little bit stronger. And so the task that lies ahead is very different, but it's a good moment to eliminate non-essential expenditure. It's very important to reprioritize, and it's also important to redefine procurement policies so that some resources can be freed for public investment. And in infrastructure, we need to continue reinforce concessions and PPPs. This has already started in some countries to finance roads and ports, etc. And we need to deepen this so that countries have the necessary infrastructure to face the future. We have a couple of minutes, and I have a question for the panel members. Let's see who wants to answer. So, in UNDP's and World Bank's opinion, what are the next steps for the region? I can try to draft a very general answer. So, first of all, we need to define the goal. And I share what Carlos Felipe said. We need to generate conditions so that the private sector becomes the growth driver in the region. It needs to be also a more sustainable and inclusive growth. So we need very strong institutionality, very strong confidence level in the governments so that they can recover. So this work is very important. We need to define the way. Then we need to find the tools according to the context, as we were saying a moment ago. And then we need to walk with the countries from international organizations to close knowledge gaps, financing gaps, operational gaps, and implementation gaps, as well as legitimacy gaps in terms of governance. This means creating spaces of dialogue with trust. We have countries that are very polarized politically, so we need to define common objectives, common goals. So it sounds very abstract, but it's actually central. And if we speak about tools, we recently launched our human development report, And there's something central. There are many things that we need to do regarding productivity and inclusion, but something very important is universalizing social protection. And this universalization does not mean new programs, and it's not only cash transfers. We need to think systemically so that social protection is universal, inclusive, fiscally sustainable, and growth friendly. I think that this is a central element, and we also need to find drivers where productivity and inclusion go together. And as Luis Felipe was saying, green drivers, climate action offers very interesting opportunities from a very micro level for more sustainable community livelihoods. And this goes up to big investments. Um, this can also create, this has also an interesting multiplication effect. So maybe my answer is very general, but I think that that's the way that we are headed. Okay, Carlos Felipe, let me give you the mic so that you can close. I totally agree with what Luis Felipe was saying. And just to close, I would like to say three things. First of all, I would like to thank for the joint work of our teams at UNDP and the World Bank. I think that something very important in this work is that information is very important. Data, these telephone surveys, these high frequency telephone surveys provide us with fast information that is extremely useful for decision making in the different countries. And I think that this is absolutely crucial, especially during these times of crisis where the situation is changing month to month. And so gathering data or collecting data once a year is not ideal. Thanks to technology, this is not uh, so costly. Doing this kind of survey is not that costly. So I think that we need to continue making progress with this new kind of high frequency data. Then the second message is I would like to repeat some of things that Marcela and Jimena said. I'm talking about education. I am convinced that the crisis that we have gone through in the region, a silent crisis in education, especially for primary and secondary education, because schools have been mostly closed. In some countries, they have not reopened yet, or at least not totally. And I think that's something that we said is that the alternatives that have been used are far from ideal. I think that some countries have used education through the internet. Some countries have used more traditional mechanisms such as education through TV or the radio. But the effectiveness of these alternatives is not very positive. We're actually pretty worried. There is not a system that's good enough so that most students can really have an effective educational experience. And I think that this is going to leave a very deep scar in this generation. And we have to think about how countries can level what they have lost in terms of learning. 2 years of learning, 2 years of silent crisis in education. And the final thing I would like to talk about is the digital gap. The pandemic has made it clear that this is extremely serious, and this has deepened social gaps. And I think that this is also responsible for some of the biggest inequalities, because those who had resources could work from home, could go to school through the internet. However, those who didn't have an access to the internet, which is approximately half of the Latin Americans, have been very limited in their possibilities. I think that the figures that we have obtained through the surveys clearly show this. And so I think that this is an urgent investment, very important investment, and it's not very costly. We need to give access to the internet to the 20% of the poorest population. This is actually not a huge investment for most countries, and it's urgent. And I think that some countries are reacting and they are given access to the internet to the poorer people in rural areas as well in peri-urban areas. So the technology is there, and now we have to implement it. So I would like to thank once again I would like to thank our teams once again for their joint work, and thank you for producing this information that is useful for the whole region. Thank you very much. And now I would like to thank Marcela Melendez, uh, Chief of Economics at UNDP, Jimena del Carpio, that from the World Bank, Luis Felipe Lopez Calva, and Luis Felipe Carlos Jaramillo, President of the World Bank for Latin America and the Caribbean. Materials related to the surveys are in the websites and UNDP and World Bank websites, and the links will be available through Zoom. Thank you very much. We have had a huge online participation. Thank you very much to all, and have a nice day.